artists need more money for their cocaine habit
because it just makes soundstage bigger.
I don't think we have access to that information.
It's absolutely not true.
Can you make it sound purple?
Guys, welcome to our second reviewer roundtable. We've got this one hosted this time on Cameron's channel over on GoldenSound. So as we did last time, we're going to have links in the description across to each of the channels of those of us who see here. So we've got Cameron from GoldenSound, Brian from WaveTheory, Amos from Currawong, and me, Lachlan, from Passionforsound. So do check out all the channels of everyone that's on the call. We've all got different styles of content and hopefully can offer you different perspectives on gear that you might be interested in. So check out all the channels. But today we're here to talk about, actually I'm going to save back maybe what we're going to talk about. Let's start with a suggestion I think somebody had in the comments, if I remember rightly, which was to hear from us an album that we had sort of had our attention captured by for whatever reason through our various listening. So we're going to save Brian for last, and you'll see why. Do you want to kick us off, Cameron, with an album that's caught your attention lately?
Sure. So it's one which I'd listened to previously and then I've sort of come back to and found myself listening to quite a bit recently, which is Dark Days Exit by Felix Laband. It's an interesting one because it's not what I would necessarily describe as, I think the best way to put it is what you'd expect music to be. It's not the kind of thing which you put on and go, oh, this is a jam. It's not the kind of thing which you bop your head to in that sort of way. It's a very experimental, semi-electronic sort of album, which is bordering on ASMR. And I'm not an ASMR fan, but this album is really interesting because it mixes music with those kind of brain-tickling sort of sound effects and really clever sound design in a way which on certain types of headphones, and in particular the Mest Mark II, which is an IM which has bone conduction drivers, it's a really interesting experience. It's one which you put on and go, this is odd. And then you find yourself still sat in that position going, about 10 minutes later or 4 songs in.
Odd in a good way.
It's odd in a really good way. And once you've listened through the whole album, go, oh, okay, hang on, half an hour's gone by. Let me try that one more time.
If I could jump in real quick, maybe we should say, like, Cameron, if you could find a link to that album on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. Links
like
to
that,
all of the songs and albums which we are talking about will be in the description.
Yeah, there
Perfect.
we go. That sounds
great.
good.
Yeah, I'm keen to check that one out as well now. That sounds very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Me too.
Amos, you got one you want to throw our way?
Well, I'm going to go back to one that actually you can't get. So there's this. That sounds terrible.
So no link in the description.
No link in the description. No, but I will link to the artist because the artist does have albums out which are really good, especially when he's live. Now, there's a guy called Jono McCleery, Jono, and he. So they were way back, about most of a decade ago now. Bowers and Wilkins had their own kind of recording thing called Society of Sound, and you'd pay for a subscription to get every month they'd have new recordings come out, and the quality was extremely high. And there were some live recordings of a variety of obscure artists, and one of them was this guy called Jono McCleery, and it was recorded, I think, I don't know what venue it was, but it was some kind of live venue or something like that. But it was just a very, very pure recording, so you could really hear it's super detailed to absolutely everything that was going on, every little movement of every person and everything like that. And it was really kind of intense because you got that feeling like you do if you're actually in the presence of a live recording. And the better gear you have, the more intense it was. So actually, I went back and listened to this and went and looked at Jono McCleery on Cobars and started going through his albums actually, and found him on YouTube and posted on this thing. Oh, this is really cool, and mentioned the Society of Sound, and he actually replied, which was very nice. But that just the real intensity, and it was a lot like some of the, maybe the closest you come is the David Chesky recordings, which are some of them are they're so well recorded and so minimally mastered that you just hear, like, if you have really good gear, they can be really, if you listen to them on a normal, like in the car or something, they don't sound particularly amazing, but they can be really intense if you have the right gear. Just like Cameron was talking about, if you have with the right gear, they can be really like, oh, now I understand what is so special about this. So that would just be reminded particularly of that one.
Cool. I'll throw mine and then we'll go to Brian. I've got, I think, 3 different playlists now called Discovery 1, Discovery 2, and Discovery 3, because when I have conversations like this, either here or in the YouTube comments, I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll chuck that in there. So I'm currently working my way through one of them. And one of the artists I put on there was Mark Lanigan, who was the lead singer for Screaming Trees, I think was his band, and Queens of the Stone Age was kind of where I think more people may have become aware of him. But he also had a few solo albums, and quite a few actually. And one of them I was listening to was I'll Take Care of You, and it's got quite a kind of, it's a little bit country. I'm not generally into country music, but it's like a country inspired blues is probably what I'd describe it as. And it caught my attention because I wish it was a better album. So I'm not necessarily saying go out there and listen to this, it's the best album you'll ever hear. But his voice, he had such a great, and sadly he's passed away now, but he had such a great voice. There's a real mixture of smoothness and gravel and depth, and it was one of those, the first track on that album, what was the first track called, let me tell you, it's called Carry Home is the first track, and the album's I'll Take Care of You. And the very first track, the quality of his vocal was just captivating to me. It was one of those things where I was like, if the whole album's like this is going to be one of my all-time favorite albums. And then for me, at least, as the album went on, it kind of tapered off a bit, but that opening track was just brilliant. With it's a very simple mix. It's, I think, acoustic guitar and vocal might be all it is in that opening track, but his sound and his delivery of the song is just absolutely captivating. So that one really got my attention. I've only actually listened to it in the car so far, so I'm looking forward today when I'm at my desk doing some work to actually put on a good set of headphones and see what it sounds like through a really good system, because I think it could be quite special. So that was my grab the attention album for now. Brian, what about you?
Yeah, so Metallica has a new song, right? And it's just a song now. They've released a single that is a prelude to their album that I think is coming out in April, I want to say. And so I have long been a Metallica fan. They are one of the bands that got me into heavy metal once upon a time, and all of that. And the recording on this one, well, let's just talk about the music first. Like the song itself is really interesting and kind of have its elements that spans their entire 40-year career. It's got some thrash, it's got some more just straight heavy metal. It's got all kinds of different elements, and it just kind of brings all of their styles over the years together, I think, which is interesting. And then the production is unlike something I've ever heard before, because there's when I listened to it the first time, I just clicked play on the YouTube video, and I just had my desk speakers and subwoofer, my desk 2.1 setup going. And when the bass comes in, Robert Trujillo's bass guitar, it is deep. Like, it just extends really low in frequency, and it was just rumbling, shaking the whole room. I was like, and it caught my attention because you generally don't hear that much sub bass content in most metal songs. Maybe in some slower paced doom metal kinds of things, they'll rumble a lot, but not really in the faster, Metallica thrash metal style. So that was unique. And then I started reading in the comments on the YouTube video and then just around the internet and all that. And a lot of people are going, where's the bass? It sounds like And Justice for All over again. And I was really puzzled by that because it was just, my room was shaking when I first heard this. And so I started going through a bunch of different headphones and different signal chains with it and all of that, and discovered that gear that can extend way down into the sub bass and do it with some speed does really well, because there's just a lot of sub bass content there. Robert Trujillo plays very quickly. It's an active low bass, but there's not a lot in the mid bass. So if the gear rolls off a little bit, like one example I have in for review the Canera Nana IEM, which is a really fine sounding IEM, but just rolls off in the bass a little bit. And on that one, it kind of has that And Justice for All kind of lean, clean, almost kind of clinical sound to it. And so that was a really interesting production choice. Just a really interesting dichotomy of sounds that came up depending on gear used there. And it, made me ask questions about well, what did they hear in the studio? What kind of studio monitors were they using? What was their intent on this? What sound are they really going for that can be so different with different playback gear? Yeah, so that's what
Maybe
I
they had
got.
a studio with full range Duntex speakers. Like I can't remember what the studio name is. But yeah, there was an interview with a guy who did Injustice for All. I think it was Injustice for All, who either mixed it or mastered it, and he
Mhm.
talked about the whole situation about there being no bass on it and what happened in the studio and how he was told to remove the bass and all that. So I can't remember the guy's name, but I know it's on YouTube because I came across it at one stage and I couldn't find it again.
I don't want to say it was Bob Rock. I think he was Black Album. I don't know. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, yeah. So
What
just
was
when you mentioned, I was like, oh, I remember seeing the interview. I just remember coming across that interview, particularly when they talked about the mastering. I think it was for Justice for All, but I again, this is months ago that I saw it, but I do remember the
yeah,
interview somewhere.
they did. And for those listeners out there who may not remember the story, like And Justice for All was Metallica's first album after they lost their original bassist, Cliff Burton, in an auto accident while touring. And so, like, I think there's a lot of speculation that just to hear bass played by a new bassist in their band, that first album back is probably really hard, right? And so I can understand that there. But then also just the sound of that album, that And Justice for All album, is just very unique, and it has kind of created a rift, if you will, in the fan base about whether you think it sounds good or whether it was a mistake, which Metallica has a habit of doing things like that, but that's a story for another day. And as far as like what studio gear they had access to, like, they're Metallica. They've been at the top of the metal genre for 40 years. Their name carries weight. They can get whatever studio they want. They can get whatever production choices they want and all of that. And like their band has expanded into a brand such that they have their own record label and like all of that. So their artistic freedom is very, very high, let's say, just because of who they are and their reputation. So that to me creates another layer of interest to talk about, like, why were they making these decisions? What were their goals, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that probably leads us really nicely into what we were going to talk about today, which was the idea of trying to reproduce as listeners, as audiophiles, whatever people consider themselves as music lovers, audiophiles, etc., to think about what is it that we're listening to. And there's terms thrown around like as the artist intended, and there's devices out there with incredibly low distortion that theoretically are then a transparent view into whatever was being produced and the way it was intended to be produced. But then the question comes up, well, based on what though? Like, we very rarely know exactly, the Metallica album's a perfect example. We don't know exactly the studio gear they were listening to it on, mixing it on. We don't know if their intention was to actually make it sound the way you're hearing it on a pair of really excellent full range headphones, or if actually for some reason they mixed it in the way they did to pull everything out of the mid bass, so that if you did have a system that rolled off, it sounded more like the leaner mix of And Justice for All. So yeah, it's an interesting segue. And Cameron, I think it was on the Darko podcast you were chatting about, and you made a really cool point about the I think it was, you were talking about the fact that if I'm remembering right, it was something to do with the Stax headphones being as fast as they were.
Oh, yes. Okay,
and the fact that there's no way that the music was mixed on something that fast. Do you want to pick up on that and probably do it much more justice than I'm going to?
So it's basically that electrostatic headphones are something which a lot of people really, really like, and I'm personally a fan of them for sort of some reasons and dislike them for others. I love the amount of resolution that they can offer. In terms of just detail retrieval, in my opinion, E-stats are going to win in 9 out of 10 cases. They're just sort of the king there. But then there's a lot of things where even if there's just an enormous amount of detail, they don't sound right. They sound weird. They sound thin. It just doesn't sound either realistic or even arguably how you'd expect that the artist or mastering engineer or whoever wanted that song to sound. And one of the main reasons that I personally think that that's probably the case is that the decay on E-stats is considerably shorter than other driver types, dynamic drivers or planars. And whilst objectively speaking that's better, it's technically better to have lower decay. It means that you can follow the signal more accurately. If the music's not mastered with that intent, then you're not actually doing things as the artist intended, and so it might sound weird. You're doing something when music is mastered, it's typically on dynamic driver speakers, studio monitors. That's the norm. And so if you're listening to something which, even if it's objectively better in certain ways, if it's completely different in characteristics to what the music was produced and tweaked and tuned and mastered on, it's not going to sound right. And that's kind of the experience I have a lot of the time with eStats. And so, yeah, it's basically just talking about how objectively better doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a result closest to what was intended, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, whether that's even a thing or not.
Yeah, and I guess that's the question. Is that, like, I've had some conversations with people, and I can't even remember who said what at this point, so I'm not going to try and attribute it to anyone, but conversations around the fact that there are different people making different decisions throughout the entire process, and there's very rarely anyone at the end that says, right, I want you to mix it this way, change this, change that, and that's the finished sound. It's the musicians at one point saying, can we get a bit more sound of the drum, or can we get a bit more sound from the vocal, or whatever it might be, and then the producer might step in and make some suggestions as well, and then the mixing engineer, and then it might go off to a mastering engineer afterwards. There's just so many pieces in the puzzle that who gets to decide? I guess it's probably whoever touches it last. But then how do we know if that's what they had in mind? Amos, you got any thoughts you wanted to throw in at this point?
Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, funnily enough, of Spongle, and actually the quality thing that Cameron was talking about was something that came to mind, because Spongle, is one of my favorite bands. We joke about with Electrostats, have you been Spongled? And if it's because it's recorded very fast, there's some very fast music in it, especially the earlier albums, that it really does work on Electrostats. But if you have a good enough system, you can hear in the mix when like samples cut in and out because the noise floor goes up and down. It's very clear, and you think, well, obviously, I forgot his name, but when he was mastering or mixing, I should say, everything in, he obviously was not. We're using the kind of high quality gear that we've been playing back his music with. And so you can hear all this stuff that he probably doesn't even realize is there, because he would have probably been using maybe generic Sony studio monitors, or just some headphones, or just some kind of studio monitors in his room when he does his mixing. So it was really funny, because when I did first heard Spongle on high end gear, it's like, wow, I can hear all the way into the mix. This is kind of really, really a little bit too overkill for it in a sense. So that's the kind of thing that came to mind is, we talk about what gear are they using, and even before we consider like the artists and all that kind of thing, what gear do they play back on? But another one that came to mind was that I know Odyssey has a system, and I have played with it because they sent me a license key to play around with it, a system whereby they can, if you have, I don't know how many actual studio monitors or studios they have set up with it, but the idea is that they can reproduce the sound in one studio through headphones in another place by using some fancy EQ and other stuff as well, so that you can actually hear what the person in the studio heard through a pair of Odyssey headphones, and it will actually adapt to those particular headphones, like you do in Roon, where they have the Odyssey presets. It's a similar kind of thing, but I think a bit more complex. But that does kind of bring it to the point, what gear are they using when they're reproducing stuff, and the other thing that came that I remember, that some music was mastered differently for CD and for radio and for maybe other formats, because they assumed it would be listened in different circumstances, because radio mixers might have maybe more mid-range forward or something like that. I don't know. I don't remember the fine details.
FM radio has very limited dynamic range. Like that's a big difference there too, which probably needs different masters for different music as well. Anyway.
Oh no, that's a good point. Though I knew there was a reason for it. I couldn't remember the exact reason. So you've just answered my question. But yeah,
and that's actually a really good point. Sorry, Amos, you finish off?
Oh no, go. Please continue.
I was going to say it's a really good point then as well, because different formats, media formats, then have different requirements. So if it's going on a vinyl versus being planned to be released on FM radio versus going to a high-res digital streaming service, each of those has different requirements for things like dynamic range. So that's going to come into it. I also remember hearing stories of studio engineers. This is going back a while. Obviously, they do it differently now, but they'd grab a copy of the mix, chuck it on a CD, and take it to their car and see how it's going to sound on a car radio.
Yep, I've heard that
So
story too.
yeah, so
Mhm.
like they're mixing it in an ideal world. If they're expecting it to go out through radio or streaming, they're probably mixing it with the studio monitors in mind, but then also mixing it with a cheap, crappy car stereo. Once upon a time, they'd even check it on like a mono AM radio, like a transistor radio, to see if it was going to sound okay based on their mix. So yeah, it's really hard to know what that actually means for us as listeners, right?
Another thing I remember reading, I don't know how long ago it was, but like when vinyl was the the most common commercial recorded music format, like there were inherent physical limitations that came with like how you could actually track things and like what order you could put tracks in and all that, because there's only so much physical space that you can cut grooves in a vinyl disc. And so like with the RIAA, preamp standards and all that helped some, but like I think a lot of like prog rock bands and all of that just kind of play on and on and on, like they would have to put some thought into how they ordered things, or else they would just completely run out of space on the record. And so that was that's another physical technological limitation, that when you say, well, what is the artist's intent, they also have to work around stuff like that. I mean, less of a problem now that most things are recorded digital, but that was a very real thing that they had to account for.
Vinyl definitely has an issue where, I think maybe some listeners may not know about the RIAA curve, is that if you play back a record through a normal preamplifier, it has a very small output signal. You'll find that there's almost no bass.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's if you think that a bass waveform has a larger, the waveform is wider. So the problem that they have, if you have a lot of bass in the recording, is that it could jump the needle out of the groove. So you have to record it with far less bass, master it with far less bass on the record, then play it back through a special preamplifier with a curve. And there are actually a variety of curves which increase the amount of bass on the output to compensate for this, but still they're limited, indeed, in dynamic range, because you don't want the needle jumping out of the groove. And of course, the outside of the record, the record's spinning at 33 1/3 RPM or 45 or the old 78s. And so by the time you get to the center of the record, actually the speed is different to the outside of the record, which is much faster. So they are very limited in again, you're right. It was dynamic range was very limited on them. And I think it's only, was it only 60? It's not very much. It's like 60 dBs of dynamic range or something pretty low. Like
by
nowadays
in my head, but that could be wrong too.
Yeah, I remember 60, but yeah, we probably could be somewhere around that. But it was much, much lower than we talk about, dynamic range. We imagine music has way more dynamic range than we think, but actually it doesn't. It might have 40, 50, I think it was 40, 50 dBs was something like average dynamic range. And, we were talking about measurements and things, with minus 110 dB noise and 120, oh, that's not good enough, 120 is better, all kind of stuff like that. It's like the dynamic range of music doesn't even come anywhere near that most of the time, even before compression. So even in really good classical, you don't even get anywhere near that. So I remember the record limitation.
I was going to say, the point about mastering engineers sort of testing their tracks on different types of equipment and things, that's something which is quite important as well, because a lot of people think that the artist themselves is the one doing the sort of final production, which is actually very rarely the case.
Yeah,
very often the artist, after the actual initial recording and sort of first stage production, has pretty much nothing to do with it. That's not the case for everyone. Some artists are very hands-on throughout the whole process, but a lot of the time it's all done by someone else, and what the artist intended actually means what the mastering engineer intended, and the artist.
It often turns out to like, what does the producer think is going to sell?
A lot of the time it is that. Yeah. I mean, loudness wars is a problem, but also their job isn't necessarily to make things sound as good as possible on the system that they're using. Their job is to make things sound as good as possible on a range of systems, or the types of systems that their intended audience is likely to listen on. And so that's why, particularly in certain genres, you might see different common mastering kind of stereotypes or issues, which people might complain about more so when they're using high-end audio headphones and stuff. Because, well, like with Metallica, most of the time people aren't listening to Metallica on a high-end headphones, which can actually, resolve or are likely to display issues with things like sibilance. That's a common problem with a lot of metal
For
stuff.
what it's worth, their new track sounds pretty good on my pair of Sony XM3, those ANC headphones.
Well, I was just going to
Sounds
say,
pretty great on those.
It does seem to be changing in the last few years. I mean, like
Yeah.
Tool's new album. Oh, that sounds great. And Porcupine Tree is not metal, but Porcupine Tree stuff just
they get pretty heavy at times, but
yeah, they do. But their stuff is just beautifully produced.
So Steven Wilson is a mixing and mastering genius for sure.
And it's also kind of interesting when the whole "as the artist intended" thing kind of leads into the question of at what point is, for lack of a better term, too much performance too much? Because so there's going to be problems in a master. There's going to be flaws. There's going to be things which actually might not necessarily be pleasant to be able to hear super clearly. Amos, I think earlier you mentioned, being able to hear when the noise floor changes when certain samples come in and out. And quite a hilariously prominent example is in the song Hey Jude. I can't remember where it is. I'll have a link in the description with the timestamp. But at one point, you can literally hear one of the band members go, fucking hell, when he fucks up something. And that's in the song. That didn't get caught. That didn't get fixed. That's in the song. And you can only hear it on sort of better systems. You don't need anything super high-end. But, there's questions of, should you be able to hear stuff like that? Should you be able to hear the noise floor coming in and out? Does that actually add to the experience? Is that what the artist would want? How much performance is the right amount to have?
Remind me of a story, actually, of someone I know went to recording of the recording of a singer, I think it was, at the studio, was invited to come in and listen. Now, when you're sitting in the studio and the recording, you can't even move. You can't do anything. So literally the singer was so, in the presence, when you're in the presence of a really good singer, not just listening on through headphones or speakers or whatever, it's absolutely mind blowing. And the person was overwhelmed and the tears streaming out his eyes and his nose was running. So his nose was dribbling and running and everything. And he couldn't move. He could not move. He couldn't wipe his nose or anything because the mics are so sensitive. And if you listen, say, on David Chesky recordings with really high end gear, you can hear sometimes someone shift slightly in the studio. They shift in the chair. And I've joked about this in reviews, like you can hear the nose hairs, moving in the person's nose or something as a joke. But I mean, the mics are that sensitive. So anyway, he's sitting in his chair. His nose is just dribbling down his face. He can't do anything. He can't wipe his nose because it'd be heard. So he's just sitting there, and then the whole thing ends. His cut is called or whatever like that. And he's like, oh my God, I can't, if anyone sees me, I'm going to look terrible. So he quickly whips out his handkerchief and wipes his nose. And he turns around, looks at everyone else, and everyone else has, their face is completely covered. And everyone's exactly the same because they were just as moved. It's like, oh, this is normal. And he never even realized that it just was that, intense actually in person. Yeah. I love that story.
So I also have an anecdote that came to mind here that I think does play into the question, like, what is the artist's intent and how do we know it? And that is, like, I have a relative who went to school for audio engineering or something like that too, and had an instructor who did an internship back in the 60s at a big recording studio, and Jimi Hendrix came in to cut an album at this studio. Now, what I'm about to say, I presume is a true story. It may not be, but it's hilarious either way, right?
It's on the internet. It must be true.
Yeah, well, exactly. So apparently, like, Hendrix comes into this studio. He lays down his stuff. Then he comes back into the room where the mixing console is. He sits down. They hand him a pair of headphones. He puts them on and listens to what he had just played. And then he takes them off and is quiet for a moment. And the mixer is like, well, Jimmy, what do you think? And the legend is Hendrix replies, yeah, that's great, man. But can you make it sound purple? And so what is the artist's intent there?
Yeah.
And, like, what is the intent of purple? Like, I know synesthesia is a real thing, and particularly when you're on LSD, okay? But, like, what does that mean?
And which piece of gear that we can buy is going to let us hear the purple in the album?
It's going to let us hear purple.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that note, I was curious to make this like maybe turn it a bit personal in a way, and I'm curious to know what each of you personally, how you approach the idea of what the artist intended. Are you looking for it? Do you not care? How much do you deliberately color your source chain and your listening chain? Anyone want to jump in with thoughts on that one?
I'll have a go at that. Okay, so there's certain things which I think it's kind of either sometimes just completely obvious that the artist wants you to be able to appreciate, like JJ Lin. He has a song called "A Song for You Till the End of Time," and it's a binaural recording, and it's a really good one. And it's quite obvious that the sort of spatial presentation and soundstage and the way that things are, well, it's a binaural recording, it's meant to sound like you're there. That's something which is important. And so using a chain of some sort, probably headphones in this case, that can represent that the best is, I would say, quite clearly closer to what the artist intended. But beyond the really obvious stuff like that, I don't think it's possible to know exactly what the artist intended. Because again, a lot of the time, the actual sort of nitty gritty of the sound quality is really not something they care about. I know actually quite a surprising number of artists, and the number of them who could not give two shits about audio, as in high-end audio stuff, is basically all of them. As long as you're able to, hear and sort of get the effectively emotional message of the music, that's what they care about, really. And also, again, you can't replicate the kind of setup that they produced it on, most likely. If it's a proper sort of mainstream high-end recording, where it's produced and mastered in a Sterling sound studio or something, unless you are in that room with those exact same ATC monitors going through exactly the same gear, you can't do the same thing. It's just not going to happen. Even if you had the same gear in just a slightly different room, it's not going to be the same. And you certainly won't be able to reproduce it with headphones. But also, the bigger question for me is, why is what the artist intended necessarily more important than what do you enjoy most? I mean, I'm pretty sure all of us here have quite a few headphones. We don't just listen to one, because it's not about which one of these is going to get me, closest to what this person wanted me to hear. It's which one's going to sound the best with this song, which one suits this genre best, which one slams more, which one's got bigger soundstage, which one has better vocal timbre, which are the things that I'm enjoying and wanting to hear when I listen to this song. Yep. It's not about the artist. I think it's about the listener. And whilst the sort of, I don't know, feel good factor of, I don't even know how to call it. It's not being right. It's not knowing that you've got something correct. I don't think that what the artist intended for you to hear in terms of the really nitty gritty stuff is as important as what you want to hear, what you enjoy most. And so I swap headphones a lot, because it's not about that. It's about what I want to hear.
And I think, as you said, and I don't mean that they're doing this in a callous way, but the artist's not thinking about you. The artist doesn't care what you hear at the end. Yeah, exactly.
The artist needs more money for their cocaine habit. That's why they're doing it.
Right. Brian, you shared in our chat that Alan Parsons piece, and it was a really interesting. And I don't remember who said what. It was referencing an Alan Parsons conversation, but I don't remember who actually said this piece. But one of the key things that was really, really interesting in there was the engineers, the mixing and mastering engineers. They're just interested in the best gear to do, or the minimum level best gear to do the job. They're not going, what's the absolute maximum level of sound quality I can get here? What's the most transparency, the most this, the most that? They're like, what piece of gear can I have in my studio that is going to tell me what I need to know to do the job? And that's where it ends. And I think that goes to the question of, they're not thinking, how do I make this work for someone that's got a $60,000 headphone setup or $200,000 speaker setup? They don't care about that.
And with mastering suites,
just to fill in the context there a little bit, it's like there's a quote out there that floats around in the audio forums and all of that is attributed to Alan Parsons, who was what was he, the mixer or the engineer on Dark Side of the Moon, I think, and then he's also
has his own prog band as well.
Yeah. And the quote is, I'm going to paraphrase it. It's something like, let's see. Music lovers use their gear to listen to your music. Audiophiles use your music to listen to their gear.
Okay, but here's a slight
Something like
deviation
that.
from that.
Yeah.
Is that necessarily a problem? Is that
Well,
necessarily a bad
it's
thing?
that is an interesting question because, like, I mean, we're all reviewers here. We spend a lot of time using music to listen to gear because that's the job, right? Um, but is that a problem for the end user to do? Like, I mean, again, if it's making you happy, I don't see a problem with that. But like, it is.
Because
Go ahead.
I mean, the like, well, as you said, you know, we're reviewers, and for me, I would say quite openly equally as interested in the actual design and engineering behind certain products as I am in what the sound quality result is. I enjoy this hobby for both reasons. I love it because of the end resulting sound that I get. I love listening to music, and I spend a lot of my time listening to music, and I want that best experience that I can get. But I also really enjoy it when certain pieces of music, you know, well recorded, well produced stuff, or just things with certain aspects, allow me to hear certain differences between gear, which I know were really hard to achieve, and someone's put a lot of work and really clever engineering into achieving.
Agreed.
And I don't think it's a bad thing to appreciate that. I think, obviously, I totally understand that the vast majority of people listening are not listening to this podcast, but listening to music aren't interested in that. The actual gear itself is a means to an end for most people, and that's fine. But it's not a bad thing to want to and enjoy appreciating the gear itself. I personally think that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like I put myself in as a music lover first, so I'm looking for the
Yeah.
gear to give me the connection to the music first. But I'm also with you, Cameron, in that I get excited to try something new if it's bringing a sense. Like these days, having been a reviewer for a while, I don't get excited about everything. Some stuff comes in, I'm like, yeah, whatever, I'll just review it because someone wants to know about it. If it has anything even remotely innovative or different, I get excited about it just to see what's this going to do for the sound. How's it going to change the experience? Is it going to let me hear the music in a different way and, you know, rediscover an album or maybe connect with an album that I previously hadn't heard in a way that connected me with the music and in that emotional sense. So yeah, I totally agree. But I also think you're right that the majority of people, it's about the music, and it's the minority of us that are actually about sometimes using the music to listen to the gear.
There's sort of two examples which show slightly different aspects of this for me. I mean, one, because I'm not sure about you, WaveTheory, but obviously, Lachlan and Amos, you guys are quite big fans of chord decks. And one of the interesting things about chord decks is the reconstruction filter.
I'm hearing
And-
you guys through a Hugo 2 right now for what.
Okay, there you go.
Anyway,
But it's like
keep going.
that's a really cool piece of engineering. Rob Watts has put quite a lot of effort into that, and in my personal opinion, it does make a difference. It's not the kind of thing which you'll show to the average person and they'll go, "Wow, this is like completely different." It's not. It's a small improvement, but a meaningful one for me. But I'm listening and thinking it's really cool that someone put the time, effort, and smarts, and it's really cool that someone's achieved that. And the fact that the music can help me appreciate that as well as that can help me appreciate the music is really cool. And that, objectively speaking, does technically get you better to or closer to, well, not necessarily what the artist intended, because the artist probably weren't using high performance reconstruction filters, but actually from how Nyquist theory, like digital audio works, it is technically more accurate. But then there's other things.
It was also intended that way to
Yeah.
reproducing the feeling of being in the front row of an orchestra and having that the intensity of that that experience. So, and for me, the Dave came closest to that, but that was actually designed specifically to reproduce the closest possible, as much as possible, of the actual music and what was recorded. And now, of course, Rob is working on an ADC, so you can get the other end of that, so you can get more better recordings. So,
and that'll be exciting to see what that does.
I'll be really curious to know what that's going to be like. I mean, there was Mike Moffat, who's unfortunately not very well at the moment, who did make his own ADCs at one point. And the Muddy Waters, if you want to hear like a really good ADC, the Muddy Waters albums were really, really intense to listen to as well. That was they were based on his designs. The Gain 1 system was his.
This is on
Mike's, so huge,
Mike
tall. Yeah, Mike Moffat's one. Yeah,
right. I didn't
he actually
know that.
showed bits of it on one of the online things that Shit Audio does, and bits of an old one. So the Gain 1. They now use a different system, but the Gain 1 system. You listen to Muddy Waters. There's a list out there somewhere on Headfire. Someone compiled a list of all the Gain 1 recordings. So they do sound really different to a lot of other recordings which are done with modern ADCs. So that's really interesting.
There's,
That's where I guess where it crosses over very much. But I mean, if you think about live recordings, I mean, a lot of people may not have gone to live performances, and they're so much more intense. There's so much more there than when you're listening, playing back through headphones or speakers, and you just go, oh, this is just so different. It's not like you realize how much you're actually not hearing stuff. You're not hearing the feeling by actually going to a live recording and then coming back and go, wow, you're not hearing it when you're listening with a normal hi-fi system or of any kind.
There's also the sense that a lot of live stuff is considerably less polished than a lot of recordings are. A lot of recordings are refined to the point of being unrealistic. It might make them more pleasant to listen to. It might make it so that you can hear more stuff, because when you go and listen to something live, you can't hear a lot of the stuff because in a real environment, it's not perfect. There's other people, there's all sorts of things getting in the way. The acoustics might not be perfect. What
PA speakers,
like
PA
Sonny
speakers are very
Landreth.
rarely hi-fi.
Yeah, one of my favorite albums is from Sonny Landreth, who recorded entire Grant Street live, and that is just so much better than it ever would have been in a studio. You can tell immediately. Even it's not high quality recording, but it's just so the intensity is there. But I remember the most watched NPR Tiny Desk concert, and anyone who's never seen a Tiny Desk concert, I recommend go watch these things. They're awesome. Was an artist I would have never even given 5 seconds to listen to, Anderson Paak. I don't Paak, and he. I would never ever listen normally to a hip hop or rap artist or anyone like that. I suppose he's considered R&B more, but
he's like R&B soul. I think I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think he's closer to R&B. Although maybe he's kind of associated with a lot of hip hop artists. I think I'm not really don't know much about that kind of area of music. But I watched this Tiny Desk concert and I thought, this is unbelievable. Like the drumming skill is on another level. But the recording quality is really good, all things considered, even with YouTube. And I thought, I'll go and listen to his albums. And his albums in comparison sound terrible. I mean, they have no bass. They're kind of boringly recorded. I guess they work fine on headphones with, heaps of bass and that kind of thing. But I really, that really kind of, you talk about as the artist intended, but when it's amazing how a lot of those Tiny Desk concerts in this impossible space have just sound really amazing, and you get so much more than often you get out of many of the albums. But it gave me a thought, actually, when we were talking about headphones and things like that. There was some discussion recently on Campfire Audio's IEMs and the Trifecta, their new triple dynamic driver. And Ken has always kind of gone against the grain of neutral and all that kind of thing. Sometimes he's made some neutral in-ear monitors like the IAs but he made his dynamic driver IEMs were all V-shaped in terms of sound, like the Atlas. There's the Vega, the Atlas. I haven't tried the new Vega yet, but the Atlas, there were some tracks I have which the ridiculous thundering bass of the Atlas, there's nothing that brings out bass like those in-ear monitors. I guess there are probably other in-ear monitors or maybe headphones, I don't know. But there are some tracks which are just mind-blowing with that crazy amount of bass, even though like it's not audiophile, it's not flatly tuned, there's no Harman target aim, nothing like that. And it's totally wrong by certain standards, but it's just so much fun to listen with these in-ear monitors. They're just so ridiculous, and it makes a lot of music so much more enjoyable. So sometimes, like pulling out headphones which are just ridiculous, have ridiculous amounts of bass, and really enjoying music that way. And that just came to mind when we started talking about, there'll be different headphones for different genres. Some tracks I listen to, would just sound like crap through a set of electrostats. And so, I might, if I was listening through stacks all the time, I might be more inclined to listen to classical or jazz. Whereas, other stuff I really appreciate more, definitely through headphones with heaps of bass. And so those are just the thoughts that came to mind when you guys were talking about those things.
There's one feature which I think actually is kind of quite apt for this topic, as in, obviously we're talking about what the artist intended, but also using music to appreciate gear and versus the other way around. Have any of you guys had a chance to try the Xyle HM1, the headphone amplifier?
No.
Okay, so that's got a feature on it called the stereo bass adjustment. And it's quite interesting because A, just from a technical standpoint, it's really cool. And B, it's quite literally saying that I prefer this. I prefer not what the artist said it should sound like. It is changing things quite deliberately. So obviously, some amplifiers have crossfeed, which arguably gets you closer to what the artist intended, because a lot of stuff's mastered on speakers, and so when you listen on headphones, sometimes the presentation's not quite the same. The stereo bass adjustment, it's all in the analog domain, and it looks at what content of the signal in the left and right channel is similar versus different, and it just adjusts the amplitude of the differences rather than just feeding them into each channel like crossfeed does. And the result, I mean, I don't know how they do that from just a technical standpoint. That's really cool. Hence the gear appreciation part. But the result is really cool as well, because it just makes soundstage bigger. It doesn't change things, put them in front of you. It just makes it bigger or smaller.
Cool.
But that's not what the artist intended. It's Michael Sale literally said, if you feel that it's been mastered wrong, use that and fix it. So I think it's quite an apt sort of
That's great
feature.
Brian, what were you going to say?
Well, so when we mentioned talking about this topic about like what does the artist intend, like a bunch of questions came up, because like one, I don't think we have access to that information except for in very rare instances. Like Jimmy Page is welcome to come listen to my system and tell me how Stairway to Heaven sounds compared to what he meant it to sound like. Now he's not going to do that, but he's welcome to anytime. The other thing that I thought of here is like when you just consider the world of the arts, and like music being one of them, but film, theater, just painting, you name it, just any kind of art, literature, whatever. How many artists come out and say, this is exactly the meaning or feeling I intended to convey?
Is it purple enough?
Yeah, is it purple enough? Yeah. And that's just not something I really, maybe very rare exceptions do I ever recall hearing from artists of any kind of art genre. It seems like there is a very purposeful intent they create something and then they step back and let the work speak for what it is. And so like, what is the purpose of using this as the artist intended standard? Like, why is that a phrase within our hobby? What's going on with that? Like, as I've thought about this, I'm like, why is that even an appropriate question? It just sounds a little bit out of place to me.
I think it comes back to this, to actually, without us meaning to do this, I think this all ties back into our first topic, which was the measurements and do measurements matter thing. There's so much uncertainty, for want of a better word, when you look at audio. If you're someone, particularly if you're someone new to the hobby, you haven't had time to experience it and work out what you enjoy, what you don't enjoy, and the fact that that's okay. I think some people come into the hobby and they go, well, but what's the right bit of gear? There's all this choice out there and I'm about to put down my hard-earned money. What's the right bit of gear for me to actually hear the music the way it's meant to be? And it's a difficult situation to be in when the answer is there isn't one. It's whatever gear you like. And I think what you said, Brian, was a really good point about whatever genre of art you look at, the artist, the creator, whatever you want to call them, they're putting down their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions, and then they're putting it out to the world. And a lot of the time it's them deliberately saying, let this stir up for you, whatever it stirs up for you, and enjoy the ride. Not, I want you to know exactly what I was thinking and feeling. And a great example that popped to mind was I'm currently listening to the audiobooks of Lord of the Rings. And it's one of the recent ones that Andy Serkis has done the voiceover for, the narration for. And it's got, and the reason I say that is it's got a fairly recent foreword in it. But the foreword was written by J.R.R. Tolkien. And he actually says in there, he talks in the foreword about the fact that a lot of people have assumed or surmised that his writing of Lord of the Rings was somehow reflecting and was providing an analogy, or I don't know what the right word is, but a parallel to his experiences during World War II. And that Sauron represents Hitler and the forces of the Nazis and all this sort of stuff. And he says in the foreword, it's absolutely not true. If that's what it stirs up for you, that's fine. But I had none of that in mind when I wrote it. I was just writing a story, and I actually don't like doing allegory where it's kind of connecting a fictional story to real events. So I thought that was a really interesting example where, as readers, if we want to make those connections and it stirs up our thoughts and our emotions around other things, fantastic, that's great. But it doesn't mean the artist was sitting there going, right, I'm going to write this or sing this in this way because it's going to make Brian feel this or Cameron feel this or Amos feel that. It's just we're trying to create certainty and clarity where it just doesn't exist, I think.
I think your point is valid there, that it's like it is kind of an external validation thing. Like, how do I know my system is good? Well, it's what the artist intended, so it must be good. Or it's what they heard in the studio, so it must be good. Like, I mean, we humans tend to do this. We like our external validations, right? So, I mean, Lachlan, you asked the question earlier, and I don't know if I responded to this directly. Like, I don't really worry so much about artistic intent when I listen to gear. What I care about is, like, particularly for vocal sounds and like acoustic instruments, what I care about is, like, do those sound like I understand them to sound in the real world? Like, that's my standard. And, like, I mean, we humans are a social species. We hear thousands of voices, you know, just going on through the course of our everyday life. We know what a human voice sounds like. So I think every one of us that has a working set of ears is qualified to listen to a piece of gear and say, that sounds like a real voice, or at least more real than it does on that system over there. Okay. Like that sort of thing. So I mean, that's my standard.
But then there's also brain accommodation as well. Like, our brains are just, you know, you'll have all had this experience as reviewers, and no doubt people watching this as well. If you've spent an extended period of time listening to a pair of headphones that have a particular coloring, and then you go and pick up a headphone with a different coloring, that other headphone sounds wrong for a while. So it also comes down to what was your most recent extended experience of listening to something, because that's going to color it as well. And therefore, what was the mixing engineer's recent extended experience of listening to things? It's just a big can of worms, isn't it? I think Cameron,
there's
you
also
say
the
something?
thing.
Oh, Amos?
And also, if we have a piece of gear, we really enjoy it, then we go online and we read something negative about it. It's like, oh, now that just sticks in our mind again and kind of and bugs us every time we listen or something like that. That's kind of really bad. So in other words, yeah, so forums and online can be really bad if you're already enjoying your Audio-Technica ATH 50s or whatever, and someone goes along and says they're rubbish headphones, then you're screwed, because you're going to go now spend more money because of something you read online.
And you're going to go back to the M50s and hear all the things that's wrong with them because that seed's been planted in your head. Yep.
Bingo. Yep, exactly.
Thou shalt not speak ill of topping.
Cameron, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that the other thing, I mean, obviously, as you said, it's people want to be reassured that they've got the right thing, that they made the right purchase, that they've got the thing which is either objectively correct and transparent or closest to what the artist intended, which, regardless of whether that exists, that's kind of a separate question. It's okay to disagree either with the artists themselves, to like the same song in a slightly different presentation, or to disagree with someone on the internet who has slightly different preferences, listens to different music, has other different gear. And I mean, I don't know how much you guys feel this, but the sort of deeper into this hobby you get, it's pretty rare that you see someone with just a pair of headphones. It might have an overall favorite, but I mean, all of us here have several pairs.
That can be seen in the frame.
Yeah, exactly. And
I'm
saying it really is a lot of a case. It's so hard to find stuff that is genuinely bad nowadays. There's really not much stuff that is genuinely bad, and there's so much stuff which is slightly better in one way, but not quite as good in another, and it's a trade-off here and a trade-off there. It's good at different things, and it's going to suit different preferences. It's like two of my favorite, not my only two favorite, but two of my favorite headphones, the Hi-Fi Svara and the Abyss 1266. That one's always interesting because for a while they were sort of kind of considered the like top two headphones, not by everyone obviously, but just generally speaking, those seem to be the ones that were talked about most. And there was so much bickering about which one was best, which one was more detailed. No, you're wrong if you like that one. No, you just like more distortion. But I'm sitting here listening going, but they're just different. If I'm listening to like electronic music, they're both great. If I'm listening to electronic music, I'll pick up the 1266 because they're just better for that. If I'm listening to classical or jazz, I'll go for the Svara because the timbre on the 1266 just isn't as good. They're just good at different things. And it's okay to it's okay to like different things. There isn't actually a right answer in 9 out of 10 scenarios in audio. And whilst that's kind of uncomfortable for a lot of people because, well, how do I know if I've done the right thing? There isn't a right thing to do.
Yeah.
You just have to try stuff. Go to Can Jams, go try different headphones, go try different amps and DACs and whatever. But know that just because someone on the internet said that you're wrong doesn't actually mean you're wrong. It just means that you have different preferences, or they're just really worried that they might have done the wrong thing and are trying really hard to defend whatever they did.
Yeah.
It's okay to like different things. And in fact, when you look at sort of people who've either been in the hobby for a long time or just deep down the rabbit hole, very rarely have they ever just settled on one DAC, one amp, and one pair of headphones and gone, this is the best, and I will never listen to anything else. There's normally at least 3 or 4 things on their shelf.
So you missed all the fun of the old, when the 2009 when the Sennheiser HD800s came out, and then the Odyssey LCD2s came out, which probably the most opposite sounding headphones you can get. All the arguments on Headfi over those two. I mean, I think I was moderating at the time, and I think I had to restart the threads multiple times because things got so out of hand. It was insane. And even before that, HD800 versus HD860 was going on for years versus K701. Oh, years and years of unbelievable crap.
It's nuts, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, and now it's just like more headphones.
And like LCD2 versus HD800, both sides were right. People still listen to the LCD2 and the HD800. They have both stood the test of time. And so it just really is kind of silly, all these arguments we have. Anyway.
And for me, in the end, part of it is actually that nothing's perfect as well. Like I did a roundup recently with the LCD5, the Susvara, the Elite, and the Expanse. There is not a headphone there that I would be upset if someone said to me, this is the only headphone you can listen to for the rest of your life. There's no complaints from me on any of those 4.
It's easy to forget how spoiled we are sometimes.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's some real first world problems going on.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And
definitely,
where I got to at the end was that all of them have amazing things and all of them have drawbacks, and not one of them is right. I personally settled on the Elite as my preference of the lot of them, but it was because it had the flaws that I was most willing to accept for the benefits I most wanted, not because it's right or it's better or it's anything like that. It's all just such a game of trade-offs, and in the end, I think what you said before, Cameron, it's playing with gear until you find what you enjoy, and that's really what's right, is what you enjoy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I think you made a good one when you the video you had about how there was Lachlan when they made a video about how everyone's hearing is really different. You showed measurements that were taken when from people's hearing and how radically they would vary. Was kind of really surprising. I mean, I knew there was a fair amount of variation, especially in the treble, where we all have a null in our hearing in the treble area, but the amount of variation, like some people must have radically different.
It was extreme,
perception.
wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there are always someone online who goes, I'm not hearing the same thing you guys are. It's completely different. I hear, the bass completely different. And you get, well, obviously your hearing is completely different from the average person. And you should, maybe it's not just the music even. It could be the hearing is just so, their perception of different frequencies is just radically different to the average person or anywhere near average. So those people are, they obviously do turn up on forums from time to time, and you just have to say, hey, your hearing's different. So
then there's the other extreme, that hearing that our ears, just human ears, cannot be trusted, period. Like that seems to be a big attitude out there. It's like, yeah, your ears are attached to human brains, so you can't be trusted. And I'm like, you do realize that our species had a few thousand years of developing science. I mean, we mapped the night sky. We made all kinds of medical discoveries, on and on and on, using just our senses to observe things. It's like, you can trust human senses. Can they be fooled? Absolutely. But they can be used in very controlled, thoughtful ways to give very accurate results too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you can deal with bias if you're aware of it. You can deal with bias by, testing your own assumptions and deliberately challenging your first impressions of things and all that sort of stuff too. So that's a good point. The ears are incredibly complicated and sensitive tools that obviously they're not going to give us some data readout that we can put on the internet and say, this is what I'm hearing, but they're still accurate and sensitive in their own way.
Right. And so, yeah, they're not a perfect tool, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of good here. It's like sometimes even, yes, our ears and brains are a flawed tool that can be tricked. It's true. They're still often, in many ways, the best tools we have.
Yep. And in the end, if it's
Yeah.
your ears are the things that connect to whether or not you enjoy the music, and as we were saying before, that's the bit that actually matters, is that you're having fun. And your ears are the only things that can tell you that, aren't they? Or not, obviously your ears aren't telling you, but the ears are the only gateway to that experience. I think that might make us a nice little endpoint, folks. What do you think? Anyone got any burning thoughts on top of their head that they wanted to share?
That was fun.
You're allowed to enjoy what you want. Stop
Yes.
bickering on the internet about it.
That's people enjoy bickering on the internet. Yeah.
Would there be an
And
internet
if you enjoy
without
that, then
bickering?
don't go for it. But...
Yeah, that's true. There'd just be a whole lot of cat memes or something, and that'd be it on the internet.
The speed, the terrible truth is that the reason we have fast internet is all because of people watching pornography. Because, no, this is absolutely true. This was, it's all because we can thank all those people spending money and on tissues and etc. that we have fast internet.
We've suddenly gone down a very different path in this conversation.
Yeah, I know where to go.
Oh, we're gonna have to
It's a long
adjust
story
the
where
ad
that came
settings
from.
on this video now. I mean, but like years ago, I think I was reading in Sound and Vision magazine that one of the reasons that VHS beat Betamax was for exactly that same reason. Is VHS allowed, a certain kind of content, and it wasn't on Betamax, and well, history is history.
That's quite funny.
But
I mean, now it's video streaming services that take up the most bandwidth. But before, like 20 years ago or something, the reason for the rapid expansion of fast internet was due to people wanting to watch video, which is the same thing but different.
How did we get onto this?
I don't even know.
I don't know. I think I'm just gonna have to go stream some 2496 audio only from Cobuzz to feel a little bit better about all of this.
I'm glad you finished what you were going to stream. Then I was getting worried.
You're not very green.
Yeah,
high bandwidth.
All right, well, let's wrap it up there. As I think we said last time, if anyone's got any comments, if you want us to talk about a particular topic in the future, throw it in the comments down below, and we'll take it on board and see if we can run another one of these things to talk about other interesting topics in the audio world. And again, Cameron, thanks for hosting this on your channel this time for us, and for doing the production and putting the links and stuff in there. But to encourage everyone to check out all the channels of all of us on here. So again, we've got, obviously, you're on GoldenSound's channel right now if you're watching this, but also WaveTheory, Currawong, and mine's Passionforsound. So thanks everyone for watching, and thanks guys for jumping on and joining in the conversation. Hopefully it was fun for everybody, both all of us and also for those watching.
All right.
See you guys in the next one.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.